Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you for another Film Fanatic show. This is yet another video in my coverage of all of the amazing films of Stanley Kubrick. So, hope everyone's doing good. Moving right along here with the series. It's a lot of fun. It's great doing. I haven't done a full this. Well, I think now that I think of it, this is the first time I've ever done this. I've done quite a few shows in the past where I've covered full franchises. I I did a show on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, the Evil Dead franchise. Uh, I did a really extensive one on the Friday the 13th franchise, which is my favorite franchise of all time, as well as my favorite horror franchise of all time. So it's an incredible amount of fun to keep the videos coming, and we're in the midst of pretty crazy storm here, a hurricane, and we just lost power. Huh. Well, oh well. I can still make this video at least. So, fingers crossed, maybe we'll come back on at some point. But anyway, yeah, we're in the midst of this hurricane that has been talked about for quite a while here, and the forecast was changing a lot. It was not looking very good in the beginning, and then it's kind of been changed to where it was going to be, pretty intense, fairly intense winds, but nothing too major, I guess. But I live here right along the coast, and I think we're going to get it the worst. We just lost power, so that kind of sucks. But it is what it is. I can still do a video, I think, and try to carry on here. So anyway, this is a new video and kind of the next installment of covering all the movies of my favorite director of all time, that is Stanley Kubrick. But like I said, I've done coverage of certain franchises. I think I left off with my favorite franchise, my favorite horror franchise, but then also my favorite franchise in general is the Friday 13th series. I did an entire series on all of the movies, and even the movies that were to a degree spin-offs of the actual franchise. The And another franchise I did, it was interesting because I didn't realize it was a franchise. I never really thought of it as a franchise. I did a series of videos on the Psycho movies, and there's about 3 or 4 of those movies, and I did a show on each of those. So very, very cool. But this is a new series that I've done now that I thought of it. Now that I think of it, I've never done before, where I'm taking one director, in this case Stanley Kubrick, and I'm basically doing a show on all of that person's work. So it's been very, very cool. I always talk about Stanley Kubrick in general. It always kind of comes up in these videos, no matter what the show might actually be about, just because he is such an inspiration for me and inspires me not only, to a degree artistically, but then also just personally. I looked at Stanley Kubrick as being like a personal hero of mine. So that's a big thing. So that's one of the reasons there's always all kinds of I don't know, to a degree spillover of where I'm going to be talking about him, and it's going to come up in all different facets. So very, very interesting. So today's show, I have a few more movies to go, and it's been a lot of fun talking about all these movies. I I really, really, really think that his track record as a filmmaker is pretty extraordinary. I think, like, when I think back of all of the amazing films but that he's done, that he did throughout his career, but just how consistent they were and just how they're all so unique. Stanley Kubrick had such an incredible sense of style in his films. I always talk about his unique background and how he got into films, which is kind of, into itself or onto itself is kind of extraordinary. Very, very unique. And I think, though, that background on how he got into film is really the reason he has or he had that unique vision. With him being, for many years, being a professional photographer for Look magazine, and all the periods of his life leading up to that, and during that period, he never really had an interest in film. But visually, and obviously with photography, he had a deep love and passion for it. And the other two aspects that I always find so interesting as to where I feel where his style came from is that he was also a professional chess player, and he made a living playing chess for quite a few years. And he was a New Yorker. He lived in New York for many, many years. And then he eventually moved to England later in his life and also in his career. But he played chess, all of these various games and matches in Central Park. I got one of my best friends, Charlie Hendrick, who I've talked a lot about on the show, who was a guy a great friend, who really was integral into getting me into film and making me into what I've become as a film fanatic. And Kubrick was one of those guys. He really got me to got me into even more. I, of course, was always aware of his films. There were a few of them that I had seen, but I never really got into the man himself as far as reading about him. And then there were lots of films at that time that I had never seen. So it was very interesting. But I remember he gave me one of the coolest things he ever gave me is he gave me this really awesome interview with Stanley Kubrick that came out during the time I believe he was shooting Spartacus. And it's an interview from like the early 60s. And Kubrick was really kind of a hermit to a degree. He never really gave too many interviews. He didn't really do lots of press. So it's a pretty rare thing to find an interview with him, especially a full-length interview that's really, really interesting. And in this interview, my friend Charlie had given this interview to me years ago, and I have it on my computer. And it's one of the greatest interviews I've ever heard a director give. It's definitely the best thing I ever came across in regards to Stanley Kubrick. Because, again, like I said, it's so rare to find any interviews with him. And you really get a sense at, listening to this interview, how he created his, well, or more or less what attributed in his life to him creating this really unique style for his films and why he had such a unique voice. And the other thing that I always find to be kind of a mind-blowing revelation, especially when I heard it for the first time in this interview, was, where he talks a lot about where he had a friend at the time when he was a photographer and he was, still living in New York. He had a friend that was a filmmaker. And his friend had invited him to this basically a student film festival. I think his friend, Stanley Kubrick's friend, was studying at New York University. I could be wrong, but I think that's what the school was. And he was a director, and they were having this student film kind of festival, and they were going to be all of the filmmakers were going to be premiering and showing all of their films. And there was, I think there was a series of short films and then more feature length films. So he brought Stanley Kubrick to the premiere, and he left. Stanley Kubrick in this interview says that he left that premiere really underwhelmed and really disappointed in what he saw, and he said he left that situation actually saying to himself that, oh, I can make anything, I can make something so much better than anything that I just experienced, and that's what actually got him into filmmaking. So very interesting, and he was older at that time too, so kind of, almost to a degree, like you can almost say that he got into film almost from this like real competitive viewpoint, and to me that's like super fascinating because typically you hear a lot the same story a lot for how filmmakers get into becoming a director is that they grew up loving films, and they it was something that their family did at that time, or they shot films when they were a kid with their friends, and then they eventually went to film school and worked in the independent film world and worked their way up. And but with Kubrick there wasn't any of that, so very, very unique and very, very interesting. And today's show is on another movie of his that, again, is just an incredible record, and that is Paths of Glory. Came out in 1957, starring Kirk Douglas, George McReady, Christiane Kubrick, who was actually Stanley Kubrick's wife, James B. Harris, Ralph Meeker, Adolph Menjo, and Timothy Carey. And this film is, again, this is a World War One epic that is, just, again, just such an extraordinary film. I don't own this film, unfortunately. I've talked about how, which is kind of, at face value, kind of ridiculous, but as much as I love Kubrick and he's my favorite director, a lot of his films I don't own on Blu-ray. I have most of his films on DVD. I have a handful of his movies on Blu-ray, but I need to remedy that, and I need to step it up and really, get all of his films at some point on Blu-ray. Just for various reasons that hasn't happened. But again, Paths of Glory, without exception, is just such an amazing movie. It's one of the greatest war films he's ever made. Obviously, Full Metal Jacket, again, just an amazing film. Another movie that's more centered on the time period of the Vietnam War. The premise of this story, of Paths of Glory, is during World War One, commanding officer Bullard Adolph Menjo orders his subordinate general, George McReady, to attack a German French position, offering a promotion as an incentive. Though the mission is foolhardily to the part of suicide, he commands his own subordinate, Colonel Dax, Kirk Douglas, to plan the attack. When it ends in disaster, General Moreau demands the court martial of 3 random soldiers in order to save his own face. And this movie was the interesting thing, which I didn't know, and I looked up some info about this movie, was when this movie came out, it was banned, and it was looked at as a propaganda film, which is really interesting. And I wasn't aware of that. And it was looked at as an anti-war movie. and it was banned across the country and across the world in all American army bases from being viewed because it was looked at as this propaganda film, basically saying that war is one of the worst, facets or endeavors that the human race can get involved in. And it was also banned in Spain. It was banned in Spain when it came out by Franco. Franco was the president of Spain at the time, 50s and 60s, and he was a notorious fascist tyrant. And so it was banned for many, many years under his regime, which was really interesting. But those two things I was not aware of those two facts. So very, very interesting. The other thing about Pass of Glory, which I think is so amazing, is I'm a huge fan of black and white cinematography, black and white films in general. I've talked about that a lot. The there's such a magic when you see a film in black and white. It gives you the it's kind of a nostalgic thing, but there's a magic about it, and there's a beauty around black and white imagery. And this film is, I think, one of the greatest black and white films ever created. Not at all a fan of, there was a trend quite a few years ago where where companies were re-releasing films, like colorized versions of films that were originally black and white. And it became a big trend, I remember, quite a few years ago, where they were releasing films that were colorized. And I just think it's awful. And I don't know, to a degree, sacrilegious, because there's a certain beauty and quality of where visually everything just pops when it's shot on film. I'm a huge component of movies that are shot on film, because I just feel the imagery and the detail that you're able to see is immaculate, as opposed to digital. And I know with there's always been a debate back and forth between now we live in a digital era, in a digital age, so most filmmakers, most photographers all use the digital format because, well, one of the biggest reasons for that is that it's a heck of a lot easier. And, to a degree, it's very efficient and it can look really beautiful. But, when you see the stories and read about the process of films, of, what directors would go through, or that what they do go through when they shoot a film on film, the incredibly long process of cutting the film, the editing process is just so intensely grueling. And it literally takes up so much, like just so much physical space. It's really expensive. Whereas the digital format, the editing process is probably cut in half. It's way easier. The the actual, when it comes to the actual editing process, from a technical standpoint, it's a lot quicker. It's more efficient, more direct. There's less material to actually work with. It's relatively inexpensive, and in comparison to actual film, it's less. It's virtually no comparison as far as the expense. And there has been a lot of films and directors who have, switched over to going digital, purely digital. One of my favorite directors, David Lynch, who famously for years shot all of his films on film. I think it was about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, he made that leap and that switch to where for the last 15 years or so, he only shoots his work. He only shoots digitally now. He's like totally abandoned the digital. I mean the idea or the concept of shooting on film. And another director who is a big proponent of shooting digitally is Robert Rodriguez. And basically, they both have the same stance. David Lynch and Robert Rodriguez have the same stance of, and of course, Robert Rodriguez directed, Sin City and From Dusk Till Dawn. He's made some amazing films. But their biggest reason for switching to the more modern format is because just the efficiency and that it's cost effective and that they're able to they feel that as artists they're able to achieve what they want a little bit quicker. It's a little bit more efficient. They have a little bit more control. All of these things, and it's more out of a thing of where it's just easier at the end of the day. And then you have modern directors like, for instance, Quentin Tarantino. He still shoots, as far as I know, he still shoots all of his films on film. And I believe, and the other director that still shoots everything on film is another one of my favorite directors of all time is Denis Villeneuve. Just incredible. He directed Sicario, The Arrival. He just most recently, or 2 years ago, did the remake of Dune. He shoots everything on in digital. I mean on film. And again, it comes down to, for them, they believe that it's just more magical. It just looks better. It's just the scope of it. The it's just more. It looks more immaculate, and I agree with that. That's kind of my stance, and I feel like Paths of Glory. All of Kubrick's films were shot on film. He Eyes Wide Shut was his last film, unfortunately, but the digital age was just kind of coming up when that movie came out, which I believe came out in '99. So it was many many years ago, but it was just on the cusp of the transitional period. But Kubrick's all of his films are shot on film, and you can just tell, and you can see that richness. And getting back to the black and white format, I think it's one of the most beautiful, one of the most gorgeous, one of the most beautiful films ever shot, especially on black and white. Just an amazing film. One of the greatest tales about war, and raises and asks lots of social questions about all of the complex things that war can bring about. So amazing, amazing film. So this is Jason Dean. We will see you next time, and hopefully the power comes back on. Peace.